Welcome, everybody, to the Nobodies Studio Inside Culture live show. My name is Sejal Thakkar, and I'm the Chief Culture Officer at Nobodies Studios. Look, today we're talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, right? And it's something that I really believe is that every organization, regardless of size or location, right, has the ability to create a culture of belonging. And at Nobodies Studios, we aim to create a studio where every nobody, regardless of their background, feels like they belong. And everyone and the leadership team, we all agree on this, that if we get this right, if we create a culture of belonging in our studio, everybody wins, right? And so today we're going to talk about this topic, really get into it, and talk about how companies can create a culture of belonging with high performing teams all over the globe, like Nobodies Studios. We're going to talk about what does it mean to belong at work, and to provide you with some practical tips that you could take back to foster a sense of belonging amongst your employees. So I'm already seeing the comments start blowing up. Thank you, Shushma, for joining us. Keep these comments coming. So joining me today, I am so excited about this conversation because one of our special nobodies, Dr. Sharena Rice, is joining me today. She's a neuroscientist, and she's serving as one of our nobody nerds. That's the name she gave to herself. So I'm not trying to offend anybody, but she's one of our nobody nerds, and she suggests and looks at ideas and helps out in the Ideation Lab. That's where she's starting off. I foresee her doing a lot more at the studio as we scale. So welcome to the show, Serena.
Thank you so much for having me, Sejal.
You are so welcome. Before we get to the topic, I really want to just start off with, I absolutely love your mission, right? Your mission or your life goal is to take as much suffering as possible and invert it. And so I know a little bit about this because you and I met a couple of weeks ago and we talked for almost 4 hours. So I got to know you pretty good during that conversation. And that's the beginning of many more conversations to come. But for the people that don't know you as well as I do, can you share a little bit more about your life goal and how do you plan on achieving this inspiring goal? I would like to know.
Yeah, the way that I came up with that goal in the first place was, for a long time, my life goal was to empower people and to inspire people, because then they can have what it takes to make things better for themselves. But then I lived in a temple and I went through grad school and I traveled the country for 6 months. And there came this question of, well, what is this all about? And part of it was, okay, well, there is suffering, but if it's not about eliminating suffering, but about changing orientation towards it, I think. So, for example, when I was a kid, I was very afraid of dogs. My grandmother told me, Sharena, dogs eat kids. You can't get near dogs.
Mm-hmm.
So I was extremely afraid of dogs when I was small. And then eventually I had to learn that dogs do not actually eat children, that my grandmother, even though she is very wise, is not always correct, and that if I change the way that I see these dogs, they are not a source of suffering. Rather, it's my thought towards these dogs that is a source of suffering. So then, okay, if I invert that and go, you know what, I can make peace with dogs existing in the world and my existing in the world, and that's the way that it is.
Wow. So it's all about your mindset and your perspective on how you're viewing these situations and how you're reacting to them. All of that resonates with me. And so you kind of touched on this, but I think one of the great things about Nobody Studios, right, is that we're giving people access to something that maybe they might not have had access to, like investing in the studio, building with the studio. And so you've got this really amazing mission. How can Nobody Studios support you in helping you achieve that goal?
I think that a lot of it will come with encouraging the foundation of scale. So then I have two ideas that will lead to probably quite a lot of scale. The first idea, I call it the rev stand, which is about finding product market fit and being able to do this in an accountable way. So for example, Kickstarter, it does product market fit in a sense, but the problem with that is that people might buy something on Kickstarter and they hope that they will receive their product, but they might find that they never receive it. And that's kind of a problem. Kickstarter can't really do anything about it. And so then the customer ends up being kind of stuck there. But if we were to create something that had more accountability to it, because all of the companies and all of the products that we create are within the jurisdiction of Nobody Studios, in that case, then we have this reinforcer, which is it's Nobody Studios. And we do have this marketplace that people can comment on ideas, give feedback on ideas, and also possibly invest in or buy a product.
Yeah, and by the way, you've got fans, because our director of our Idea Lab, Min Bogata, is just chiming in the chat saying, so grateful to work with you in the Idea Lab, Sharena. Your way of thinking and reviewing ideas is inspirational. And this is what I love, about just giving people this opportunity to be able to work with like the Idea Lab, submit their ideas. And I know you've submitted more than one. And so, I want to get back to talking a little bit about the culture, right? We both agree on this. And we talked a little bit about this when we met and when we talked on the phone the first time, that culture is the glue of every organization, right? And we know that it needs to be consciously cultivated to live, to achieve some of the desired outcomes that we want. And so just based on what you've experienced so far, right? What, in your opinion, what makes Nobody Studios unique from a cultural perspective?
I think that it's largely the people who are drawn to this journey. After all, if you say, we're going to create a venture studio that is launching 100 companies in 5 years, then of course, all of the people who think, no way is that ever going to happen, they are going to run for the hills. But people who are drawn to it, well, they will be supportive of that. But the other piece to it is that there's this sense of openness about it, as well as, yes, the nobodies are there for you. And when you have something that is beyond just your job description, and it is part of the culture, then that's when people start going the extra mile in terms of pulling ideas and connections out of a hat that you would never get just from having something that's defined beforehand. All towards a common goal, of course, but that is a way to do it.
I agree with everything that you're saying. I think that we are when I joined, which was a couple of years ago, right? I remember talking to Mark McNally about sort of like, why do you want to have a chief culture officer so early? At that point he was still in his garage, right? This was like just being formed during the pandemic, by the way. And I was like really shocked when he invited me to the leadership team that early in the game, because I've been knocking on startups' doors saying, bring me in, let me do some workshops, let me help you with your culture. And I've heard this over and over again and gotten the door slammed in my face, like, no, it's too early for us. Give us your business card. We'll reach out to you when we scale. And I'm like, that's too late to be reaching out to me. We want to be proactive about how we go about it, right? And so, Sharena, when I was thinking about this show, I struggled a little bit about what topic to focus with you on, because you're so brilliant. Honestly, I could talk to you for hours about so many different things. But I chose this topic of belonging, because one of the things you told me during our conversation really resonated with me and really struck a chord in my heart. It was that you told me that in 8th grade, you wrote a 45-page single space typed documentary of your observations of human behavior. And by the way, in case you missed it, what I said was she did this in 8th grade. Like, that to me is just so brilliant. And I want to learn more about sort of what inspires you to write that paper. And that's the reason why I chose this topic of belonging, because I'm like, if she could write something on human behavior in 8th grade, she can bring a lot of value to this conversation. And hopefully help other people that are listening to help create belonging in there. So what inspired you to write that paper, by the way?
Curiosity about humans and why they behaved the way they did, but also the sense of, okay, well, I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere. And so was there a way to bridge that kind of gap? And so I pursued this curiosity about humans, and I would sit in class, I would write in my notebook, I would observe people and think about ways, well, why they did the things that they did. Because the books at the bookstore on psychology and philosophy, they didn't explain it to me in a way that I could apply to my everyday life, I thought, as a teenager at the time.
Yeah. And so how long did it take you to write that paper?
It took about, it took from February to about June, probably. So that took about 5 months.
Oh, wow. Okay. So then you and I have, I mean, we talked about this, I also felt the same way where I felt like I didn't fit in or I didn't belong. And I started kind of having these feelings, in elementary school as well. And so I think belonging is something that's personal to each individual, right? And we also know that we need to achieve belonging in order to create these high performing teams. So what does to belong, what does that mean to you? I'm curious to know how you interpret that, and then I'll share with you sort of what it means to me to feel a sense of belonging.
In my mind, what creating a sense of belonging is making room for elephants. So all of these elements that are probably strange or different, well, they are all things that can possibly be celebrated, or they can be oriented towards as, hey, this is a curiosity of human behavior. This is interesting. Even when it comes to things that are completely normal, and looking at them and going, wow, you know what? It's kind of curious that most people do things this way, when actually that seems to be maladaptive in the long term, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is this space of holding space for elephants so that, okay, that silence, it doesn't necessarily need to be an awkward silence, but it can be a silence that is just a dignified silence. Or when it comes to awkward situations, for example, I was at an event the other night and they had a technical glitch. So I made a joke so that it could distract people from the technical glitch. They could laugh for a bit and the person on the stage could recoup. This wasn't to be disruptive so much as it was to make light of something to lighten the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what does that mean for you? So at Nobodies Studios, right? What does that mean for you? What, as a nobody, what is it? What are the things that you're looking for to feel that sense of belonging at Nobodies Studios?
I think that it was baked in at the beginning, and it's wonderful that it was. Where, okay, the first time I met up with Nobody's leadership, it felt like meeting old friends for the first time. And when you get that sense with people, then you can probably make some great things together, including great conversations. But I think that continuing with that, even as we scale, that is somewhat of a challenge because, okay, a family is not the same as a community, is not the same as a town or a state or a country. So then, whereas a person may totally be into digging a pond in their backyard for their temple because they live in a temple, that was my life before, then they may not be as willing to dig a pond for their country. And so there is this feeling of scale and who is connected with that. So for example, I know that if I dug that pond, then my community, they would directly be impacted by it and they would enjoy the ducks that would eventually go and live in that pond. But in terms of a huge place, it is harder to think about that. Okay, this pond, how many people from outside of this state will actually ever see this or benefit from it?
Mm-hmm.
I think that part of it is continuing to connect the dots, because no act of kindness is ever actually wasted, even if it seems small, even if it seems rather local,
Mm-hmm.
and build upon that as a narrative as well.
Agreed. Our definitions are like very similar, right? I mean, I think that's one of the things, again, we strive for in Nobody Studios is to make sure people feel that sense of community. Because generally speaking, when you feel that sense of community, and I'm talking about, that could be a sense of community at the studio, it could be at your place of worship, it could be on a sports team, it could be the parenting group that I take my, whatever community, however you define that. But if you feel like you're a part of the community, then you feel a sense of purpose, right? And you take that and that gives you meaning for your life. And like you said, that's what's going to push people over. And I truly believe that that's going to be our competitive advantage, that if we continue to foster that sense of belonging that you felt as you've dealt with the various members of leadership, and everybody that I've interviewed on this show has basically said the same thing, that they felt that sense of belonging, even though, and this is the cool part, even though most of us haven't met in person. I mean, you and I met a couple of weeks ago, but a lot of this Nobodies, and especially after this equity crowdfunding campaign, by the way, we are over 800. I just checked this morning. We've got 830 new equity crowdfunders that are joining our studio from over 31 different countries. So we've got people located everywhere. And so you're right. It is going to be challenging as we scale to continue to foster that sense of belonging. So what tips do you have? What are some of the things that at Nobody Studios, the leadership who's listening in on this, that we need to make sure that we continue to do with our teams to foster the sense of belonging, especially as we scale and as we get more global, because we're irrationally global, right? So what are some tips that you have for us?
I think that part of it is to emphasize this network effect that we're building, which is that there will be a time, probably in the near future, where you can visit any US city or any major city in the world and say that there is a nobody there. And you might have a reason to meet up just because they are also a nobody. And you never know quite which synergies will arise from that. You might find that just by talking with each other that they happen to know someone who is completely relevant to what you do, even if they are completely different from who you are. And so, for instance, Sejal and we met up, and Sejal is a recovering employment lawyer, and I'm a neuroscientist, and we had this wonderful conversation about culture. Would we have necessarily expected that? I'm not exactly sure, but it was a wonderful one, and then this conversation emerged from it. So there will almost definitely be many more down the road as well.
Absolutely. Heck yeah. And I'm going to make sure of that because, again, I think when I look at culture, this is everybody that directly and indirectly touches Nobody Studios helps to define our culture. And, that's why I really reach out to people and connect with them because I want to get input. Like I remember one of the first times we talked was when I wanted your feedback on the culture manifesto that I'd put together, which was, something that I had worked on. And I was like, I'm going to reach out to Sharena and just ask her for her feedback. And, I was nervous, honestly. I was nervous going to all the different members of the leadership team and asking for their feedback because I didn't know how it would be received. But I really learned a lot during that situation. And that was like, I got to get over that because we are going to be a feedback rich culture. We're going to have to get used to getting uncomfortable with doing things like that because in order to foster a sense of belonging, we're going to have these conversations. We know that social bonds are going to be something that we're going to have to build with each other. We're going to have to recognize each other. We're going to have to respect each other. And if we connect with each other in the ways that you and I have, and in the ways that I have with all of our other nobodies, well, we have this, I felt this from you right away, Sharena. It's like you're positive, you're authentic, right? You show up as you and you're supportive. You gave me some really good feedback on that culture manifesto where I went back and I was like, she helped me see things from a different perspective that maybe I hadn't seen at. And, after I walked away from that, I made some, substantial revisions to that document and you were very helpful. So thank you again for helping me with that. And so I want to ask you one more question. One of the things that we talked about when we met was that you have a ton of different superpowers, right? Like you're that's why I know you're like an octopus. We're going to be seeing you go into a lot of different spaces into the studio. But I wanted to ask you, as you know, as someone who's sort of leading the way on culture, is which one of your superpowers would you like to contribute to helping us take our culture at the studio to the next level, especially as we scale? I would just love to hear from you on that.
It's probably going to be systems thinking. And okay, thinking about things both in terms of what is happening in the short term and the long term of the studio, because of course an idea might go viral at some point, but then there is that matter of, will it sustain over time? Or rather, what if something is really slow to begin at the beginning, but it creates this network effect where it really does have this return over time that works in the bigger scheme of things, and how to have that balance. And so I'm going to be asking a lot of challenging questions because I'm a scientist and my job is to be skeptical of practically everything, and to do things like test hypotheses, to ask about methods, to ask about whether we are barking up the right tree, and to generally bring these kinds of ideas to the table so that we can have something that works efficiently.
So how do we do that? How do we do that? Do you vision it being like a new company? Because you know, one of the things that we're doing at Nobodies Studios is this whole concept of building companies that are machine of machines, right? And so, you know, our chief Nobody and I have had several conversations about what are some, you know, for example, to build 100 companies in 5 years, we're going to need a lot of people. Right. And so one of the companies we're thinking of is like, oh, well, how do we build a company to help us with our recruiting efforts, you know, so that we can recruit at scale. And so that's an idea of something that would be used not only kind of like RevStand, but not only something that would be used within the studio to help us recruit for the studio itself and all of the companies we're going to be building, but also something that could be bought by, you know, people outside the studio to help them in their recruitment efforts. So do you have like an idea off the top of your head that to build a culture of belonging, some sort of idea or a system that we could put into place that can help us as we scale? And I know I'm putting you on the spot, so if you don't have an answer, don't worry about it, but just I thought I'd run it by you.
One question that I've asked several times to different people is, what are our bottlenecks? So everything is going to have some sort of limiting reagent to them, whereas there is actually quite a lot of other things that just plain exist as an ambient thing in the world. But what are the bottlenecks that prevent us from getting what we need in order to pursue certain ideas? That, I think, is sometimes people first. Sometimes it is that we don't actually have the infrastructure of having a system so that when we actually do have those people in place, that they are received in some sort of way where they have a sense of fit within the system and that they know that they are making a contribution. And so setting these things up, both of them at the same time, it is something that can widen our bottleneck so that more people and ideas can go through, and it can realize this dream of being a high velocity venture studio. Of course, it's very thoughtful. It needs to be done through skillful means.
Absolutely. I love those ideas. And I definitely want to continue our conversation and keep talking about this. And, you know, this is one of the things that we all, you know, we say as part of culture. It's an ongoing process, right? Like it doesn't just happen overnight, and it requires talent and skill and time. And I'm so glad that we have you within our Nobody network, and someone that I look up to as a mentor that can help me make sure that we get those systems and the strategy in place. Because again, belonging is a really important, you know, goal of ours. People first is a mindset, and we want to make sure that we continue to build that into a fabric. By the way, people are loving our conversation today. We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to read a couple of the comments that are coming in. Gord Sherwood, another Nobody for sure, someone that's going to be helping us with our culture. And I'm really looking forward to sort of, looking at ways that we can make our studio even more neurodiverse friendly and just bake that right into the fabric of our organization. And he's writing, imagine all the people sharing all of the world. And definitely all I could say is sharing Nobodies Studios for sure. We welcome, everybody. That's one of the reasons why we're doing the equity crowdfunding campaign right now, is to give people access who may not have access to join the studio. And it's not, just want to make this very clear, because our equity crowdfunding campaign ends today. Today is the last day, 11:50 p.m. But I want to make this very clear. It's not so much about the investment. The minimum is only $100. So this isn't a part of sort of our capital fundraising, that we're expecting to make a big raise out of this equity crowdfunding campaign. Would we love to do that? Absolutely. But this was more part of our crowd infused strategy. We want to build diversity right into the equity crowdfund campaign, because that means we're having people from all over the globe, all walks of life, that are buying into the studio, who have a stake into our studio, that can have a say into our culture, into the way that we're building our ideas, can bring their ideas like Sharena's doing to the studio and contribute in whichever way they want, whether it's talent, whether it's influence, whether it's capital. Right. So if you've heard about all of the things that Sharena and I are talking about, contribute to this journey and get a part of a venture studio that, again, $100 minimum. So Sharena, before we end, is there anything else you want to add to people to get them to, want to contribute to our studio, to become a part of our journey? Is there anything else that you'd like to give, a piece of advice for people that are watching this today?
Let's see. My advice is that indeed, this is a network that is growing. It is growing quickly, and that it is more fun to be on the creation of the wave than dog paddling on the back.
I love that. I love that. And we just had somebody put a comment in there that I love it. And what a great way to end our show. Sharena, thank you so much. But I want to read this to you. Purpose, meaning, community, relationships. Such important issues in both of our personal and professional lives. These are the keys for living a healthy, happy, and fulfilling life. Excited to join Nobodies Studios. Now, I can't see who that is because it just says LinkedIn user. But thank you so much for that comment. Thank you, everybody, for listening in. Sharena, thank you again for being a nobody and being on this journey with us. I can't wait to co-create our culture with you and other things. I know you're blowing up the Idea Lab, and so I know you're going to continue being such a valuable asset of our team. Thank you again for being here. Thank you, everybody. Again, go invest in Nobodies Studios. Today is the last day. You've got like 10 some hours left. Thank you again, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.